I want to thank Murren for that warm introduction, and to thank the committee in particular for their kind invitation to come here again. It's become, as Murren mentioned, an annual pilgrimage, and I'm very glad to make it because this is a school that exhibits those wonderful opportunities for very vigorous debate and provocative discussions about where we are and where we have been, and sometimes where we might be going. And I'm very well aware that there's an awful lot of work that goes in to the organisation of these events behind the scenes, and I want to thank the committee for all that work, to thank you all for coming tonight. And I do hope that this weekend will provide an opportunity for some kind of constructive reflection on that broad theme of commemoration. How do we remember, how do we commemorate the events of the revolutionary period? To what extent will we have the capacity to survive a decade of commemorations before we all collapse from commemoration fatigue? There's much interest, for obvious reasons, in the 2016 commemoration of the 1916 Rising. But we are, of course, dealing with the 1916 Rising as the beginning of a whole sequence of transformative events. And it was a transformative era. There's an awful lot of different layers. There are an awful lot of different layers to it, and we need to be conscious of the need to try and do justice to those layers. So I do look forward to those discussions. I do also think it's an opportunity to point out some of the difficulties as well as the opportunities associated with commemoration. They've always been apparent, and we have to be conscious, I suppose, of what we mean by commemoration, what we mean by memory, what we mean by history, whether or not there are linkages between all of these things or whether they can actually cancel each other out. To what extent can we strike a balance when it comes to accuracy, when it comes to sentiment, when it comes to emotion? And we also have to distinguish, of course, between what might be done by the state as an entity and what might be done by the people in relation to remembering, in relation to commemoration. Last week I was in Dublin on this very night last week, speaking at an event on the theme of memory. And by an extraordinary, sad, but perhaps appropriate coincidence, the news had come through that Brian Friel, the great playwright, had died that very morning. And I say it was sadly appropriate because Brian Friel has often been referred to as the father of the modern memory play. And because we were discussing memory at some length, it did seem worth reflecting briefly on what his approach to memory was, what his approach to commemoration and to the past was. And of course, as a playwright, Brian Friel could be exceptionally reticent when it came to elaborating on his craft or explaining his art. But he did give a few interviews about how he approached the past, and he did refer at one stage to the idea that he tended to inflict what he called tiny bruises on history in order to make his plays work. And he elaborated on that to the extent that he was able to say where there was a tension between historical fact and the imperatives of fiction, I'm glad to say that I kept faith with the narrative. A lovely, eloquent way of justifying what he had done in relation to memory, in relation to the use of history. And of course, he had the right to do that. As an artist, he was exercising artistic license, he was exercising his artistic freedom. But the reason I mention that tonight is because commemoration, on the other hand, instead of inflicting tiny bruises on history, can often inflict gaping wounds on history. And we do need to be conscious that commemoration and history are very different things. To a certain extent, historians are required to be party poopers when it comes to commemoration, because they do need to remind of that basic issue that commemoration is not the same as history, and that commemoration is very much dictated by contemporary concerns. Why wouldn't it be? Those contemporary concerns can produce narratives which are loosely labelled historical narratives that can often be selective, that can often be contrived, that can often be distorted. And a number of historians alongside myself, have referred publicly on many occasions to the difficulties that this might present, particularly in relation to the idea of communicating history as widely as possible. There is a term for that officially. That's public history, the idea of a popular and public discourse around history. Sometimes people distinguish between the public history and the professional history. in the sense of historians who are trained in a particular way to write professional history. Personally, I don't believe in labouring the point about the distinction between the two. I certainly don't believe, and I would share Garrod O'Tuig's view, the Galway historian of this, that the two of them are somehow mutually exclusive. What Garrod O'Tuig referred to recently was the fundamental obligation that the professional historian has to attend scrupulously to the evidence. And many people who are involved in communicating history, whether at that public level or in a professional setting, do attend very scrupulously to that. But, of course, there's no point in being snobbish about this. Historians are not in charge of commemoration and should not be in charge of commemoration. It's interesting that it was a novelist, Toni Morrison, who used the word rememoration in relation to a much wider sense of a societal engagement with commemoration and memory in the past, rememoration as opposed to commemoration, and that can mean a whole variety of different things. I would argue that historians can be well placed to highlight the extent to which acts of commemoration or narratives of commemoration could be built on a mixture of omission and assertion and affirmation. They can also, as the historian Claire Wills points out, involve a mix of pious reverence and political point scoring. And there's certainly no shortage of that at the moment in relation to how to remember the 1916 Rising. There's also the question of commemorations having the capacity to divide. We hear the use of the word inclusive an awful lot, and that too can be laboured to a point where it becomes very, very contrived, particularly when you're dealing with the reality of divisive events historically. But certainly that capacity to divide is something that has caused many commentators on the conflict in Northern Ireland or the war in Northern Ireland to reflect on commemoration and what it might mean, because commemoration in Northern Ireland can be particularly contested and can be particularly difficult, and of course is very, very frequent. What Edna Longley suggested, the critic, was that commemorations are as selective as sympathies. They honour our dead, not your dead. And again, she was reacting to the extent to which history and commemoration became a weapon in both sides of the war in Northern Ireland. So certainly you can see how that works. What Kieran Brady, another historian, has referred to an intense competition between political activists for the prize of social memory. And that sense of social memory is one that is worth elaborating on. The idea that, yes, social memory can be perhaps about competition between political activists, but it's also about something much deeper than that, in the same way that commemoration that we're talking about tonight in relation to 1916 and what followed is also something that is about much more than competition between political activists. But that idea of a social memory, or a memory that we can engage in, or a memory we can own, or a memory that can belong to us, is something that we need to be very mindful of. But it's also a reminder, of course, that when you are talking about the social memory of a particular group or a particular collective, you have to reflect on the idea that one group's freedom historically can represent another group's subjugation historically. So the capacity to divide, I think, is certainly relevant there. And yet, I would not argue that historians or any of us need to be overly negative when it comes to commemoration of the revolutionary period. There are great opportunities in relation to commemorating that period. There are positives when you consider the extent to which it can ignite an interest in history, when you consider the extent to which it can prompt a reinterpretation or a re-examination of some of our long-held assumptions, or some of what are referred to as traditional assumptions, and when it can involve recovering stories that have been buried, difficult, taboo issues that have been avoided. Those kind of experiences can sometimes be brought out into the open. It's also ultimately about generating greater knowledge. It's about enhancing citizenship, particularly when you think of citizens engaging with a fundamental question. Who are we? And another question. Where do we come from? And another question. How did we get here? If it can prompt more reflection, more discussion, more debate on those subjects, it can only be a positive thing. So that combination of history and commemoration is very complex, but it can also be empowering. And I think that we need to acknowledge that positive role that it can play. What I want to do briefly tonight, I suppose, is look back. particularly when we consider this mix of contrivance and reverence and political point scoring and enlightenment, as well as divisions, in relation to remembering the revolutionary period. How has this worked in the past? When we consider some of the difficulties of commemoration, some of the divisions, some of the rows, they're very illuminating in relation to the kind of rows and discussions that are going on at the moment. It has always been thus, you might conclude, in relation to the competition for the prize of memory and for the control of commemoration.